This webinar is being recorded, and there is an ASL interpreter available for anyone who wants this service. Just pen the interpreter screen to your screen to view them during today's presentation. Hello, this is the National Council for Preservation Education Summer Webinar Series, 4 informational sessions held in July on topics important to the Federal Historic Preservation Program. I'm Julie Johnson, the Director of NCPE's Internship Program and the moderator of the webinars. This series is offered by NCPE in collaboration with the National Park Service's Cultural Resources, Partnerships, and Science Directorate. We have 3 panelists speaking today on the theme of partnerships. We'll cover the topics of tribal relations, climate change, and the Great American Outdoors Act of 2020 in later webinars this month. First, I want to welcome all the NCPE interns, the NCPE alumni, which includes some of today's speakers, interns and fellows from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and other organizations and agencies, the National Park Service employees, and anyone else attending. I'm delighted you can participate and look forward to your questions and comments, which I invite you to put into the chat at any time. Before I introduce our panelists and my co-host at NPS, I want to tell you about the National Council for Preservation Education, called NCPE, or NCPE for short. NCPE is a nonprofit national membership organization founded in 1978 by a coalition of colleges, universities, and trade schools with programs in historic preservation, offering degrees or certificates at the 2-year, 4-year, or graduate levels. NCPE's purpose is to support instruction and research in the field of historic preservation, coordinate preservation education initiatives with other private and public entities, facilitate the exchange of information and ideas concerning preservation education, and raise public awareness about preservation education and the field in general. All of this is accomplished in a variety of ways. The one most familiar to our attendees and panelists is the Internship Program, which operates in cooperation with the National Park Service. But NCPE has other programs, such as hosting the website PreserveNet, which includes a very active jobs board, maintaining an online guide to academic programs in historic preservation and allied fields in the United States, setting standards for inclusion in the guide so prospective students can find the best program suited for them, publishing the annual peer-reviewed journal called Preservation Education and Research, or PER, and hosting conferences and an annual meeting where an outstanding preservation educator is honored with a James Marston Fitch Award. I will elaborate on some of these activities during future sessions in the webinar series. I'm delighted to be joined today by Paloma Bolasny, the Youth Programs Coordinator at the National Park Service's Cultural Resources Office of Interpretation and Education in Washington, D.C. Paloma is responsible for assembling the speakers in this webinar series. Paloma, would you like to say a few words before we continue on with our speakers today?
Sure. Thank you, Julie. Hi, everyone. I'm Paloma Bolasny. I'm the Youth Programs Coordinator for the Cultural Resources Directorate at the Park Service's Washington office. And I work with Julie in administering the NCPE Internship Program along with some other internship programs. I want to thank all of our presenters for presenting today. I appreciate your time and you sharing your expertise with all of us here today. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today for the first webinar of our series. We do have an ASL interpreter with us, and we will work with Zoom to make sure the future webinars are better enabled for this service. But I do want to offer some tips that are good for everyone to make your webinars and programs more accessible. Participants should speak one at a time rather than interrupting each other to allow an interpreter time to translate. Each speaker should identify themselves when speaking. So for example, saying, this is Paloma speaking. And if you're not speaking, keep your microphone off, which our presenters are doing. And then when you're speaking, turn your videos on. With that, I will turn it over to Julie to start with our speakers. Thanks.
This is Julie Johnson speaking. Thank you for those important reminders, Paloma. I really appreciate it. And all your time and energy today putting together the entire webinar series. That was a big help to me. We have 3 panelists today, as you can see from the board, and they're going to be speaking on various topics related to our theme of partnerships. You may put any questions for them in the chat, and we'll respond after each presentation. There will also be time at the end of the session for more Q&A. I will also provide contact emails for all speakers at the end, as well as information about the next webinar in this 4-part series. Finally, all of the sessions will be uploaded with closed captioning to NCPE's YouTube channel, which can be found by searching YouTube by the organization's full name, National Council for Preservation Education. The first speaker today is Julee Ernstein. Julee is the supervisory archaeologist with the National Register and National Historic Landmark Program within the Cultural Resources Partnership and Science Directorate. She joined the National Park Service in 2016 from her former positions as Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer for the state of Nevada, several decades of teaching and program administration in higher education, and work as a cultural resources consultant. Julee's work with the CRPS Directorate and the National Register Program in particular allows her to draw on these experiences to collaborate with colleagues at all levels of government, local, state, federal, and tribal, as part of a national program to coordinate and support public and private efforts to identify, evaluate, and manage the country's historic and archaeological resources. So I hope that Julee can take over the screen from me and let me know if that's working for you, Julee.
This is Julee Ernstein talking, and that is working just fine. Is everyone seeing my screen?
No, I don't.
Okay.
That was Julee Johnson, by the way.
Yep.
Something's happening. That looks good.
Super. I am going to be a good citizen and start my timer. I want to thank you all for the invitation today and welcome wholeheartedly our new cohort of NCPE interns. It is always one of the highlights of summer to have you with us, whether physically at the interior or working remotely. My task today from Paloma was to provide a very high-level overview of the National Register program, but to really focus on the roles that different agencies or constituencies play both in and around the National Register program. So that is what I'm going to aim to accomplish today. The first thing I wanted to talk about was just what do I mean when I say the National Historic Preservation Program? So what I'm really talking about, and I won't read all these words here for you, but it's a public-private collaboration. So what I mean by that, government, non-governmental effort in which we work collaboratively to do any number of different things, be it identifying, documenting, evaluating, interpreting, managing, perhaps arguing over or speaking in a spirited way about the nation's important cultural resources. And the thing that I really want to stress and hope you'll walk away with is that the dynamic nature of the historic preservation program. It is absolutely, not anti-growth as folks sometimes misunderstand, but it's really about managing compromises between past and present, and it is most definitely subject to change, be that change in best practices in response to emerging issues and things such as climate change. But historic preservation can also, as we all know and hope, be an agent for positive social change. Very briefly, the National Register of Historic Places, the program area I work in within the office at the Washington Support Office, is broadly speaking three things. It's sort of an honorific, meaning it gives property owners, it gives communities, it gives sometimes formerly disenfranchised groups or underrepresented communities bragging rights, because this official list of these places acknowledges and celebrates the contributions and the voices of the many to our larger collective national past. Just as easily, the National Register program is not only or solely about these lovely bronze plaques up on buildings and structures and places you might see around you. It's also a planning tool. As many of you may know, or perhaps you're learning for the first time, National Register eligibility is the threshold, the linchpin in many instances for federal agency decision making. So it's about far more than just these plaques that you see. And out there on the ground in the real world, preservation can of course be an economic driver in a lot of different ways. Through some of the other programs you'll hear about today, things like the rehabilitation tax credit. Preservation provides jobs, and certainly the National Register program has provided my colleagues and I some very beneficial work. But it's also an economic driver insofar as the local hardware store, the hiring agency, the folks who work for architecture and engineering firms who bring through adaptive reuse and other practices unused or sometimes even decaying properties back into circulation. So the National Register program at the Washington Support Office in DC, where I work, that's the administrative home to the National Register of Historic Places, but this is truly a national program. And even within the National Park Service, our park units, as well as our regional offices across the country, all play very important roles in the National Register program, both the listing of properties and also those discussions about the eligibility of properties and how that assists federal agencies, including the Park Service out in our parks and regions, in making decision-making as they move forward. So I've got a list on the left-hand column of these are some of the common actions or requests for action that come in to our staff in our office. And each of us holds formal delegated authority from the person with possibly the coolest job title in all of historic preservation, the keeper of the National Register of Historic Places. And we can sign the paper on the keeper's behalf, speaking on behalf of the keeper in doing any of these things that you see on the left side. And I'm happy to talk with any of you in further detail about those. But the other piece I want to draw to your attention is the right-hand column, where we regularly, in the course of our daily work, we provide technical assistance to any and all. We answer all manner of public inquiries. A private property owner says, hey, a local university class is talking with me about possibly listing my home in the National Register. Does that mean I'm going to have to open it up to the public? We field all sorts of questions there. We go on site visits if that helps us to better understand a property about which there's some conversation going on. We provide training. We provide guidance documents in the form of a whole slew of National Register bulletins, all of which are available online through our website. We engage in a range of special projects and initiatives across the course of the year. And we engage in both internal and external collaboration, presenting at national conferences, and you may have seen us at some of those. In addition to, we're members of standing working groups. Some of the folks on this call have been in meetings already today together because we're part of working groups. Let me move along here. And then here's the piece that I really wanted to talk to you about. And I apologize, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but I thought it was a pretty decent representation. And what I wanted you to take away here is the fact that there are we serve many constituencies. And just to very quickly, property owners, community members, certified local governments who will comment on districts or properties proposed for listing within their boundaries, elected officials who may be brought in by concerned citizens who are either for or perhaps against a proposed listing, and they'll elicit a letter from their legislator. We also have cultural resources consultants who generate the documentation and some of the scholarship that goes into these nominations. Educational institutions, and this can be everything from K through 12 institutions. We, for instance, our colleagues in the Cultural Resources Office of Interp and Ed for years worked on teaching with historic places, documentation, and travel itineraries, and things that take us into our next category, the travel and tourism industry. Many people, like when they vacation, like to visit National Register listed properties. They may wish to stay in National Register listed homes and boutique hotels. The building and design trades all are involved, and a part of the constituencies we serve. Professional organizations, be they historians, public historians, landscape historians, architectural historians, historians of every sort, archaeologists and anthropologists, all of the professional organizations that are the disciplines that form the preservation field, they will weigh in at important moments, either about listings or about new regulations that may be promulgated, about guidance that our program may have under discussion, because of course we solicit public comment from all of the constituents in the process. And then we have a bunch of folks who we sometimes think of as the nominating authorities, because we don't write these nominations ourselves. They're the folks who forward them to us. And they may come to us from state historic preservation offices, if they're on federally managed land, from federal preservation officers. They will come in from tribal historic preservation officers in the instances of federally recognized tribes that have assumed the responsibilities of state historic preservation offices. And then we have a number of other groups, an organization called the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, NAFPO, and a group called the National Council of State Conference, I apologize, the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers, who are larger aggregates and speak on behalf of SHPOs. And then again, this is not an exhaustive list, but last but not least, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, whose job it is to advise the President and Congress on historic preservation matters. And each of the folks that you see listed here, they are our constituents, and they are our colleagues and our partners, and they engage with us as authors of nominations, as commenters. For instance, states have state review boards who vet or who review the nominations before they are ever forwarded for final technical review by staff in our office and then signing for listing. We have stakeholders of all sorts. Anybody with an interest in that property, they don't have to be the property owner themselves. People engaging in advocacy, sometimes statewide preservation groups will be very, very interested in a particular action that may be happening. Consumers who want to enjoy these places and visit them, who are simply interested in history and want to download a copy of a nomination and read it because they're traveling to Memphis and they want to take the tour at Sun Records and they want to read the nomination. Or those of you who are interning with us, I would invite you to read the nomination for the main interior building because it is really, really, really interesting. And in fact, I'll make a copy of it available to Paloma and she can share it out with you. And that is my timer, so I will move along quickly. I talked about the nominating authorities, review agencies, educators at all levels, and we all have an oar in the water on this program. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Julie. I really appreciate it. Are there any questions for Julie E? Paloma?
Hi, this is Paloma. I don't see any, but I see that, Julie, that you posed a question to everyone. Who here has prepared a National Register nomination? We did have someone who raised their hand, so yay. And hopefully this inspires other folks to either write one and see what one even looks like, what a National Register nomination looks like. It looks like we do have a question. I apologize if I missed it, they write, but what are the qualifications for a recognized historic place?
Unmute myself. I was trying to be a good citizen. In short, it's for a property to be eligible for listing, it needs to possess significance in one of four areas. And this can be significance at the local level, at a state or regional level, or at the national level. So significance in association with a particular, a historic event of any sort that has made, an important contribution in our history, associated with a significant individual, someone important in the past, in the areas of architecture and engineering, so design or construction, or I'm an archaeologist, so my I can't say I have a favorite, but the one I spend a lot of time on, that's the fair way to say it, information potential. And that can be archaeology, but it can also be, it may be ethnographic information or other sorts of cultural information. So that's the significance piece. And then it needs to possess integrity. And I won't go into any of these definitions, but there are 7 aspects of integrity. So if we were playing bingo, we could call them out and someone would yell bingo after they heard location, design, setting, material, workmanship, feeling, and association. And all of this information is available for download in fabulous How to Complete the National Register form. And this is Bulletin 16A. And I've got the website on my last slide, and I can send this on to Paloma. Thank you very much for asking.
Great. Yeah, good question. We have another question that I think can also be answered in the bulletin, and that is, what is significance? And that's a great question. And Julie, can you also refer them to the bulletin for more information on that?
Sure, absolutely.
Great. Yeah. The bulletin seems like the answer they write. Yes. Lots of answers in there in the multiple bulletins. Thanks, Julie.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate answering those specific questions and also referring us to other material that we can look at, hopefully easily online. I believe all the bulletins are there. This is Julie Johnson, by the way. Our next speaker is, let's see. Next speaker is James Alvey, former archivist turned grants manager. James Alvey works for state, tribal, local plans and grants. James graduated from the University of Mary Washington with a BA in Historic Preservation and started at the National Park Service as an NCPE intern. Why don't you see if you can take over the screen, James?
Thank you, thank you. This is James. Is everybody seeing my screen?
I can see it, James.
Excellent, thank you much. Okie dokie. So, yep, I am here and can tell you that if you scratch at the system long enough, then yeah, you can get a job in the National Park Service from the National Council for Preservation Education. But yep, I am here today to talk with you guys about the State, Tribal, Local Plans and Grants Division, which is way too long to ever be able to remember or say. So we call ourselves STLPG, really roll off of that STLPG and lean into the pig. But as I am here today to talk to you a little more about partnerships and how we engage in partnerships, as Julie well laid out, the National Federal Preservation Program has a range of partners, and the State, Tribal, Local Plans and Grants Division manages the Historic Preservation Fund, which has a number of competitive and non-competitive grant programs. I'm going to focus here on the non-competitive grant programs, primarily because they fund 3 of the biggest non-federal governmental partners in the Federal Preservation Program: the State Historic Preservation Offices and the Tribal Historic Preservation Offices and the Certified Local Governments. We'll get back to certified local governments in a little bit, but I'm going to focus here for a moment mostly on the state and tribal historic preservation offices. The states are absolutely mandated by the National Historic Preservation Act to have a state historic preservation officer. The tribes, federally recognized tribes, are welcome to participate. They may opt in to participate. At the moment, this means that we have all 50 states, District of Columbia, 5 territories, and 3 freely associated states that are state historic preservation offices. And then we have well over 200 tribes that have opted to participate as tribal historic preservation offices. We give grants to both of them on a yearly basis to fund their operations. For the states, we have about 57,675,000 was the most recent appropriation. So between 59 of them, you can see that it averages about to $1 million to fund their office, of which 10% does have to be passed through to those certified local governments, which will be defined again later. But for the tribal historic preservation offices, they've only received 16 million in the latest appropriation. So between 200 of them, you can see that the average is about $80,000 for a tribal historic preservation office. So where with the SHPOs, we very much fund an office. With the THPOs, we pretty much fund a person in a truck. But it still funds their participation in the federal preservation program. So not only do we give money to these people, but also as well that in receiving their funding, particularly the state historic preservation offices are held to performing in the 9 required program areas as outlined in the National Historic Preservation Act. Administration there is running the office. Historic preservation planning is that every state is required to have a state historic preservation plan that guides the preservation that they perform. So STLPG reviews and approves their state historic preservation plans as part of receiving their funding, which is generated under the historic preservation planning. Then we've got survey and inventory, which is if your preservation education has involved any amount of finding historic resources, you have some experience in survey and inventory. Then the National Register is another program area, and it is their participation in the National Register program and processes as well explained by Julie. Then we've also got development and covenants. Development is when they do physical preservation work themselves or fund physical preservation work. And covenants is long-term preservation of historic resources. They have to have a program for that as well. Then we got the preservation tax incentives, which again, they have a role in that, and that will be well explained by Liz after me. And then review and compliance, which is Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, very much empowers and well defines a role for the state and tribal historic preservation offices in reviewing any federal undertaking to ensure that it minimizes any potential harm to historic resources. And then we have the local government certification program, which is those certified local governments that I've talked about, but not defined yet, and that's still coming. Other is the final grab bag, which is the less required of those other 8, and it really is a melting pot for everything that's they're eligible to do, but not quite as much mandated to do. Some example of that general outreach, Habs Hair Hals projects, and support for general preservation organizations. So STLPG very much promulgates the guidance for successful performance in these program areas, with the assistance in particular of the specific subject matter offices of the National Park Service. So for example, Julie in the National Register and NHL programs, and Liz in the Technical Preservation Services. So we very much do much more technical assistance than just giving money. But finally, I will define that last of the big 3, what we have for federal preservation partners, which is the certified local governments. And we get a lot of people who are very much say yes when asked if their local government is a certified local government, generally speaking, because they pay taxes to it. So, you know, they're very much hoping it's certified for whatever we're talking about. But what really it means is it comes from the National Historic Preservation Act. It has a very specific definition in this outlaid there. And it is local governments that have been certified to participate in the federal preservation program. And so that means it gives them very much defined roles, opportunities, and makes them part of the federal preservation program, as pointed out in terms of National Register nominations by Julie, and also as well all other preservation activities. So to be a certified local government, it is very voluntary. A local government chooses to opt in, and to do so, it must meet minimum program requirements, which is generally speaking to pass a preservation ordinance that protects historic resources in their jurisdiction and convenes a preservation commission of qualified individuals, also sometimes referred to as an architectural review board. And they review and guide historic preservation in their jurisdiction. And being a CLG not only gives them certain rights and roles in federal preservation programs, but it also gives them access directly to the National Park Service and their state for technical assistance. And it also gives access, if we back up to that first slide, where 10% of the state's annual grant must be passed through to CLGs, means that they have statutory access to some of the state grant funds through state grant programs. And then also as well, that they have some access to federal grant programs as well. And those are the big three preservation partners that the national state, tribal, local plans and grants has a steady relationship with guides and funds. We also as well have quite a number of competitive grant programs at this moment. Most of these are generally what it says on the tin. All of these are links, and when the slides are shared with you, you can really explore each of these individual grant programs yourself on our website. The one I'll call out is the Paul Bruin Historic Revitalization Grants. That one is actually to set up a sub-grant program in rural communities. So the person who actually applies for Paul Bruin does not actually do preservation themselves. They instead set up a program by which they fund competitively other grant projects in rural communities. Generally speaking, our grants, to be eligible for our grant programs, for all of those project grants, discrete project grant programs, competitive grant programs, is we flow from the National Register of Historic Places and National Historic Landmarks programs. So everything must be listed in or eligible for the listing. And that tells us as well what are we preserving and why. Then as well that that work must meet the Secretary of Interior standards and guidelines for archaeology and historic preservation, which really is Liz's purview. And I especially will be talking about that after me. But the work must meet that to be preservation. Then we also require project sign and press release to be able to alert people that federal funding is happening in their backyard for their comment and awareness as part of Section 106. And then also as well that they have to report to us twice yearly on what the activities of their grant. And then also the grant has to be preserved for a long time, so subsequent to the federal award, to protect that federal investment. So we also require an easement placed on the property by statute. In general, that's about 15 years on average. And it just ensures that, again, that if we come into a historic property and we replace the roof, that it doesn't get torn down 2 years later. Generally speaking, to be able to apply, most of our partners, both the regular ones and the nonprofit and educational institutions, are the ones who are eligible to apply. But they have to be registered in SAM.gov, System of Award Management, and that ensures that the government is giving to known entities. And then for nonprofits, they have to provide that proof of nonprofit status. So they're as given by the IRS. Then they apply for grants.gov by a number of CFDAs, Catalog of Federal Domestic Assistance Numbers. Save America's Treasures is 15929. Historically Black colleges and universities is 15932. And all of the competitive grants are 15904. And you can set up a safe search in grants.gov that will tell you anytime one of those CFDAs opens. Thank you, everybody. And that is STLPG, particularly our partnership programs.
All right. Thank you, James. Paloma, do we have any questions for James?
I don't see, I know, James, your audio cut in and out a few times, so no, you can't do much about that when you're speaking. And somebody did answer what the freely associated states are. The Federated States of Micronesia, Republic of Marshall Islands, and Republic of Palau. So thank you. If anybody has any questions for any of our speakers, put them in the chat, and our speakers are going to stay on after our last speaker has presented and answer questions. So do stay on after Liz speaks, and we're going to try to ask them any question you may have. And if we don't have time to answer your question today, I'm sure our speakers are more than happy to follow up, and Julie will provide you with everyone's contact information.
Great, thanks, Paloma. And thank you, James. That was great. Our next speaker, this is Julie Johnson, by the way. Our next speaker is Liz Petrella. Liz is an architectural historian with the Technical Preservation Services of the National Park Service. Ms. Petrella is responsible for the review of federal historic tax credit projects for compliance with the Secretary of the Interior's standards. She has worked on publications and guidance related to the tax credits, as well as sustainable treatments and HVAC, and their use on historic properties. Liz holds a Master of Historic Preservation degree from the University of Maryland, and she came to Technical Preservation Services as an NCPE intern while at the University of Maryland. Now, Liz, can you take over the screen?
I will do my best.
All right. I'm hoping.
Hopefully you guys are now or soon about to see my screen. Let me know if you do not see my PowerPoint presentation.
I see it. I see it, Liz.
Great, thank you. So thank you to Julie and Paloma for inviting me today. And as Julie mentioned, like James, I too came from a NCPE internship a little longer ago than James, but today I'll share with you the work of my office, which is Technical Preservation Services, or TPS as we call it. We have a number of programs aimed at property owners to help them preserve, restore, and rehabilitate their historic buildings and landscapes. TPS is part of the Washington office or headquarters of the National Park Service, and we are responsible not only for the administration of the federal tax incentives program, but we're also charged with developing standards and guidelines for the treatment of historic properties, primarily through publications such as the Preservation Briefs series, Preservation Tech Notes series, and other publications you might be familiar with. We also organize workshops and conferences dealing with various preservation topics. So we are the keepers of the Secretary of the Interior Standards and their accompanying guidelines. The Secretary of the Interior Standards are the central document of historic preservation philosophy and practice in the United States. The standards were first developed in 1976. There are 4 standards, which for 4 distinct but interrelated approaches to the treatment of historic properties: preservation, restoration, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. And it is recommended that when undertaking work to historic property, one of these treatment standards is undertaken. The standards themselves are neither technical nor prescriptive, but they're intended to promote responsible preservation practice that helps protect our nation's irreplaceable cultural resources. So first, starting with preservation, which focuses on the maintenance and repair of existing historic materials and the retention of a property's form as it has evolved over time. So on the screen, you can see Drayton Hall in Charleston, South Carolina, built in 1738, and it remains virtually unchanged as it's evolved since its construction. Rehabilitation acknowledges the need to alter or add to a historic property to meet the continuing or changing uses while retaining the property's historic character. On the screen, you see Owella Mill in Owella, Maryland, built in 1918, and it was rehabilitated for use as rental apartments while they were able to maintain the industrial character within this new use. Next, we have restoration, which depicts a property at a particular period in time, a particular period of its history, while removing evidence of other periods. So for example, we have Montpelier, constructed by James Madison in 1723. It was enlarged substantially by the DuPont family in 1901. In 2003, the Montpelier Foundation and the National Trust for Historic Preservation decided to take it back to Madison's period of significance. So all DuPont era changes were reversed, and it now appears as it did during Madison's time. Last, we have reconstruction, which recreates a vanished or non-surviving portion of a property for interpretive purposes. And this example is the Governor's Palace in Williamsburg, Virginia, which was originally constructed in 1721, burned in 1781, and then was rebuilt according to historic plans and archaeological evidence in 1934 during the creation of historic Williamsburg as we know it today. So the intent of the standards is to assist the long-term preservation of a property's significance through the preservation of historic materials and features. The rehabilitation standards are used most often for preservation projects, and those standards apply to all property types, all building types, sizes, uses, and construction materials. The standards apply to the exterior and interior properties, as well as the building site, environment, landscape, and any attached or adjacent new construction. And all 10 standards must be met to receive tax credits or to comply with any preservation ordinances. So there are 10 individual standards, but they can be broken down into 3 basic principles, and that is to retain and repair historic materials, features, and spaces, retain the historic character of the property, even if the use of the building changes, and to design compatible reversible additions. The standards may be used by anyone or any organization planning or undertaking work on a historic property. They are required through regulation in several instances, including grant and aid projects, tax credit projects, both at the state and the federal level, federal agency historic preservation activities, and state and local review of rehabilitation proposals. And they're also adopted by historic district and planning commissions all over the United States. As the keeper of these standards, we also publish guidelines for applying and interpreting the Secretary's standards in all treatment scenarios. The guidelines provide just that, guidance. They're meant to assist in applying the standards to all property types and buildings. They're not meant to give case-specific advice or address expectations or unusual conditions. And for each subject in these documents, they offer a recommended and a not recommended treatment. So kind of a do and a do not treatment for each area. And on the screen, you can see just a snapshot from our masonry section in that document. In 2011, our office created the first guidelines for sustainability for rehabilitating historic buildings. And like the previous guidelines that covered a whole range of subjects, this guidance gives, again, the recommended and not recommended approach to many subjects relating to sustainability and historic buildings. Over the years, we have also created guidelines for cultural landscapes, covered bridges, and most recently in 2021, 2021, our office published the illustrated guidelines on flood adaptation for rehabilitating historic buildings. And each of these larger documents can be downloaded from our website, and I believe many of them are also able to be purchased through the government printing office. So we have over 150 titles in print and online. The collection is a great resource both for beginning preservation scholars and practicing professionals as well. We also have an alphabetized index by topic of all of our publications and web guidance on our website as well. So you can search by topics such as masonry or new additions, windows, things like that, and find what you're looking for. So TPS, Technical Preservation Services, is probably best known as the administrators of the Historic Preservation Tax Incentives Program. So some quick basics about that program and how we administer it. Owners of eligible properties are eligible for a credit, which is equal to 20% of the qualifying rehabilitation costs for the project. The tax credit is a dollar for dollar reduction in the amount of taxes you owe. So it's not an income tax deduction. A project must be what we call substantial, which means the cost of the project must exceed the greater of $5,000 or the property's adjusted basis used for tax purposes. It has to be an income producing property that can be rental residential, commercial, industrial, office space, or agricultural, for example. It just can't be your sole personal residence. And finally, the property must be a certified historic structure, which means it needs to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places, either individually or contributing to a listed historic district. The tax credit review process is a partnership with the state historic preservation offices and the Internal Revenue Service. The IRS is the entity that issues the credit itself. The SHPOs and our office review all architectural drawings and rehabilitation proposals to confirm compliance with the Secretary of the Interior standards. The credit is syndicated through limited partnerships often. It can be earned by an owner or a long-term lessee, as defined by the IRS. The federal preservation tax credit can be combined with low-income housing tax credits, state tax incentives for historic preservation as well. And in all cases, all rehab work must meet the standards for rehabilitation to be eligible. Since its creation, the tax incentives have spurred development of historic resources and structures of every period, type, style, size. The program has been very successful over the past 45 years, and to date, over 47,000 properties have been rehabilitated under the program, equaling over $116 billion in investment. Some of the program benefits are increases to property values. It promotes investment in older neighborhoods, increases state and local real estate taxes, creates jobs, stimulates other rehabilitation projects nearby, attracts new residents, and promotes smart growth, and finally, it saves historic buildings. The tax credit program is used for a wide range of historic properties and project scopes. On the smaller end, here we have an example of a small project by cost. It's the Willard Merrill House in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and their recent tax credit project was only for $14,000. The project consisted of repairing and repainting their exterior wooden features and just repairing plumbing problems in the basement to bring this building back up to its best use. So not every project is going to be a large or complicated undertaking. On the other end of that scale, we have one of our most expensive projects, the Fontainebleau Resort and Hotel in Miami Beach, Florida. This 1954 modern hotel with a 1959 addition was rehabilitated for at a cost of over $317 million. That project included repairing and restoring the exterior skin and features, restoring the lobbies, ballrooms, and other primary spaces inside of the hotel, and rehabilitating the guest room floors, and included an addition of a guest room tower and site amenities. So sometimes buildings come to us and it can be a little hard to see the historic building under modern changes. The two left-hand photos are of a historic image on top and a pre-rehabilitation image on the bottom of a commercial building in Hutchinson, Kansas. During the rehabilitation, the false facade was removed and the building was rehabilitated for continued commercial use. And because this is not a restoration program, the applicant was not required to restore the storefront exactly as it had been, or reinstall the same signage. Any changes just had to be compatible with the historic building and meet the rehabilitation standards. This Baltimore row house was partially destroyed by fire and neglect, and the individual row house and its neighbor were rehabilitated for continued use as rental housing. The missing and deteriorated interior structure and historic features were repaired or replaced to match. Compatible new windows and interior finishes were installed, allowing this building to continue to contribute to the historic district rather than be demolished. And finally, we're tasked at times to find ways to keep historic features in a building when owners or at times code requirements propose their removal. In this example, we found a creative way to retain the original multi-light classroom doors in a former school while still providing the required fire separation. A new door has been installed behind the multi-light door. So when residents open their solid door into their unit, the original door acts more like a screen door. And so that simple idea allows for the historic feature to remain in use while meeting modern code requirements, as well as meeting the rehab standards. So that's just a quick overview of what we do, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. And I will stop sharing.
Great, thank you, Liz.
Yeah.
Any questions, you can put them in the chat. And while you are all thinking about questions, I do have one for Liz. What would you say is the state that uses the federal historic tax credit program the most, or the state that the tax credit program has been used most in? Where can you see it really most evident? Is there like a really active state?
Really good question. I could probably look up something, not quickly enough, but we have a handful of states that volume-wise, number of projects,
Right,
do a lot, and that would be New York, Louisiana, Missouri, Virginia. There's the one, Ohio maybe, that come to mind. And often the states that have associated state tax credits, we see the most projects because applicants will pair our 20% tax credit with the state credit to get even more financial incentive back.
great.
That's fascinating.
This leads me to another question. Does every state have their own state credit program?
They do not. We at least used to put in our annual report, which can be found on our website, a blurb about the states that have state tax credits. I want to say it's over half, but not 3/4 of the states. And it tends to come and go. Most state credits have to be reauthorized every so often. And I want to say Minnesota's state credit is just now ending because it was not reauthorized, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And New Jersey just got a new credit. So that list changes periodically.
Great.
That's great.
That was fantastic. Thank you. We have one question for Liz. How long does the process take to be approved for the credit? Good question.
That is a very good question. And there's kind of two answers. An application goes in duplicate to the SHPO. They are supposed to review that within 30 days. If it's a complete application, if it's not missing any information, they keep their copy, they forward a copy to us, and then we have 30 days. So you'd like to say that that's a 60-day review period, but often things take much longer because they didn't include all the necessary information, or because state offices or our office is understaffed at certain times. So the short answer is 60 days. The long answer is it can be more like 6 months or something like that. So.
Thank you.
All right. I'm going to see, this is Julie Johnson speaking now. I'm going to see if I can share my screen again. Yeah, here we go. Well, thank you so much to all of our speakers. This was great. On the screen right now is a list of our other NCPE sessions for the summer webinar series. And if we don't have any other questions for our other speakers, I want to wrap up and extend a big thank you to our panelists for joining us today. Everyone did such an excellent job of packing a lot of information into a short amount of time. And I want to thank the attendees for the great comments, questions, and for participating today. If you registered for this session, you are registered for all 3 sessions. And just want to finish up here with contact information for all of us today. And I can also provide that information to anybody just by asking.
And Julie, can I pop in here and give an extra preview of the our next webinar of who is speaking? I know you said tribal relations is our next topic, but we're going to hear from the current program manager for the Tribal Historic Preservation Program. We're going to hear from the program manager for the National Park Service's Park NAGPRA program. And we're going to hear from the Northeast Regional Tribal Liaison. So we have 3 wonderful speakers to follow our wonderful speakers from today.
This is Julie Johnson again. Thank you, Paloma, for that brief commercial. I should have thought of talking about that myself. So thank you so much for letting us know what's to come. It sounds so exciting. Follow up, please, by email or phone with the panelists or with Paloma or myself. If you have any questions, we'd all love to hear from our attendees. And so I think until next Thursday at 3:30, we are done.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you all. And I'll see you back here in a week.
Yes, that's great.
All right. Thank you.
So long. Bye-bye.